My paralyzed husband said I was just his free maid. What I did next shocked him. After years of devotion, I heard the words that shattered my soul. My husband, once my partner, now a man bound to a wheelchair, had said I was nothing more than his free maid. His words echoed through our quiet home, cutting deeper than any physical wound ever could. The man I once cared for, held, nurtured, and loved, had reduced me to a mere servant, a caretaker whose existence had no value beyond the daily chores. But what he didn't know was that beneath the exhaustion and the grief, I was no longer the woman who silently accepted everything. His words ignited something in me, a deep well of strength I hadn't realized was there. What I did next wasn't just a reaction. It was my awakening. I showed him a side of me he had never seen, a woman who would no longer live in the shadows of his need. The house was eerily quiet, a stillness that clung to every corner, every crevice of our once lively home. I had spent so many years in this place, nurturing not just my husband, but our life together. It was a home that had once echoed with laughter, with plans for the future, and with love. Now, it felt like a shell, empty, hollow, and weighed down by the constant undercurrent of tension. I had grown used to this quiet, to the monotony of the daily routines. I had become the caretaker, the woman who put aside her dreams, her desires, and even her own well-being just to ensure that he was okay. But all of that was about to change. I had never expected it to happen like this. Not after all we had been through. Not after all I had sacrificed. My husband, once the strong, independent man I had fallen in love with, was now bound to a wheelchair, paralyzed from the waist down. I had been there for him through the dark days, through the rehabilitation, the endless doctor's appointments, the physical therapy sessions. I had watched him go from a man who could do anything to a man who now needed help with even the most basic tasks. And I had stepped in. I became his legs when he couldn't walk, his hands when he couldn't feed himself, his voice when he struggled to speak. I had given him everything I had, and yet, here we were. That night, everything changed. I was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, as I always did. The rhythmic sound of chopping vegetables was the only noise in the room. The quiet hum of the refrigerator in the background. I had gotten so used to this solitude that it almost felt comforting, until his voice cut through the silence, sharper than it had ever been before. "Are you just going to stand there all night?" His words were laced with irritation, his tone colder than I had ever heard it. I turned around to see him in his wheelchair, his face twisted in frustration. "I can't believe it. You're just my free maid, aren't you? That's all you've ever been." The words hung in the air like a poison. It felt like a slap, not just physically, but emotionally. The man I had given everything to, the man who had once promised me the world, had reduced me to a mere servant in my own home. I had been doing everything for him, day in and day out, and yet, here he was, ungrateful and angry. How could he say that? How could he see me as nothing more than a caretaker, a maid, someone who existed solely to meet his needs? The shock hit me first, followed by the sharp sting of betrayal. I had always known that taking care of him, putting his needs before mine, would take a toll on me. I had always told myself it was worth it. But now, hearing those words, I realized how much I had lost. I had lost myself in the process of caring for him. I had become so focused on him that I had forgotten about me. I felt the anger rise within me, hot and intense. But even more than that, I felt the deep, aching sadness that threatened to swallow me whole. All these years, I had given my love, my time, my energy, and my identity to him. And this is how he saw me? As a servant? As someone who was only valuable because I could perform tasks for him? I swallowed hard, trying to hold back the tears. But they came anyway. I felt the weight of them on my cheeks as they slid down, hot and uncontrollable. I wasn't sure if I was crying because of the hurt or because of the realization that I had allowed myself to be treated this way for so long. I had let my love for him blind me to the fact that I had lost myself in the process. I wiped my tears away quickly, furious with myself for showing weakness. I couldn't do this anymore. I couldn't live like this. I had given him everything, and in return, I had been reduced to nothing more than a tool. His free maid. For the first time in years, I didn't feel sorry for him. The pity that had once filled my heart when I looked at him was gone. I didn't feel sorry for the man who had once been my partner in life. I didn't feel sorry for the man who had once promised me love and devotion. I felt angry. I felt betrayed. And most of all, I felt something deep within me stir. Something I hadn't felt in a long time: strength. I was no longer the woman who silently accepted his needs, his demands. I was no longer the woman who had sacrificed everything, only to be taken for granted. I was no longer the woman who stood by and allowed herself to be treated like this. I was someone else now. I was someone who had had enough. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't going to let him break me anymore. I took a deep breath and turned to face him, wiping the last of my tears away. The words I had been holding back for years were on the tip of my tongue. I had spent so long keeping quiet, hiding my feelings, suppressing my anger, that I had forgotten what it felt like to stand up for myself. But not anymore. "You don't get to speak to me like that," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "I've been here for you. I've given you everything. And you think I'm just a maid?" His face twisted in confusion, but I could see the guilt creeping in. He knew he had gone too far. But it didn't matter. It was too late for apologies now. I had made my decision. "What I do next," I said, my voice trembling with emotion but filled with resolve, "will shock you. I'm done being your free maid. I'm done being invisible." I turned away from him, the air thick with the weight of my words. For the first time in a long while, I felt a flicker of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. For me. The days that followed felt like a whirlwind of emotions, each one pulling me in different directions. What had happened that night, those words that had cut through the very core of who I was, seemed to linger in the air between us like a dense fog. It wasn't just the words themselves that had hurt me, though they stung deeply. It was the realization that I had allowed myself to be invisible for so long. For years, I had put his needs first, but now I saw the truth of what I had become. I wasn't his partner anymore, I wasn't his equal. I was his caretaker, his maid, someone who existed only to fulfill his every demand. And the worst part? I had let him get away with it. But something in me had shifted. Something deep and powerful stirred inside, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had been running on fumes for so long, giving everything I had to take care of him, that I had forgotten what it was like to take care of myself. I had forgotten who I was before I became his wife, before I became his caretaker. I had lost myself in the role I had chosen to play for so long. But I wasn't going to lose myself any longer. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the weight of everything began to sink in. I had been trapped in this cycle of duty, of unspoken resentment, of love that had long since faded into obligation. I knew I had to make a change, but what kind of change? What did it mean to stop being the woman who silently accepted everything? I didn't have all the answers yet, but one thing was clear: I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't keep sacrificing everything for a man who saw me as nothing more than a means to an end. I had to find myself again. I had to rediscover who I was, beyond the role of caretaker, beyond the role of wife. But how? The next morning, as I made my way to the kitchen, I found him there, waiting for me. He was in his wheelchair, his eyes downcast, as if he knew he had crossed a line. I couldn't tell if he was sorry or if he simply didn't understand the depth of what he had said. He hadn't apologized yet, and part of me didn't want him to. Apologies felt too easy, too superficial. They wouldn't change the reality of what had been said, nor would they change the years of silent sacrifice I had endured. "Can we talk?" His voice was quiet, tentative. He didn't meet my eyes, which only made the whole situation feel worse. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I even wanted to have this conversation. But then I remembered how badly I needed change, how badly I needed to speak my truth. So I nodded, not trusting myself to say anything at that moment. He sighed, as if bracing himself. I didn't mean what I said the other night. I was angry, frustrated. I didn't mean to hurt you. The words sounded rehearsed, as though he had been practicing them in his head for hours. And while part of me wanted to believe him, part of me couldn't just let it go. It wasn't just about the words. It was about everything that had built up to this point. I'm not upset just because of what you said, I replied, my voice shaking but steady. I'm upset because of how you see me. I've given up everything for you. My life. My freedom. My dreams. And you, I cut myself off, taking a deep breath to steady myself before continuing. You've reduced me to a maid. To someone who exists only to take care of you. And I don't know who I am anymore. There was a long pause. He looked at me, his eyes wide, as if he didn't know what to say. Maybe he didn't understand, but I couldn't hold it in anymore. The anger that had been building up inside me for years was bubbling over, and I needed him to hear it. I'm tired, I said softly, the words slipping out before I could stop them. I'm tired of pretending that everything is fine. I'm tired of being the one who keeps it all together while I fall apart. I could see the guilt on his face now, the realization that he had crossed a line, but the damage was done. I could feel it between us, a crack that had opened up, and I wasn't sure it could ever be repaired. His face softened, but I didn't want his sympathy. I wanted respect. I wanted recognition. I've lost myself, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. I've put your needs before mine for so long that I don't even know who I am anymore. I can't keep doing this. I'm not your maid. I'm your wife. His eyes flickered with something, regret, guilt, maybe even shame, but I couldn't let him off the hook so easily. I couldn't just forgive him because he felt bad. I needed him to understand the magnitude of what he had said, to understand that I had been invisible for so long. You can't just treat me like a servant, and then expect everything to be okay. I'm not okay. And I won't let you keep treating me this way. There was a long silence, and I could see the wheels turning in his head. He had always been a man of action, of words that carried weight. But now, in this moment, he was frozen, unsure of how to fix something that felt so broken. And part of me didn't care if he ever fixed it. The real change had to come from me. I think I need some time, I said, my voice softer now. To figure things out. He nodded slowly, though I could tell he didn't fully understand what that meant. He didn't get it yet. But he would. I would make sure of it. As I walked away, I could feel the weight of my decision settling over me like a heavy cloak. This wasn't just about him. This was about me, about reclaiming the parts of myself that had been buried under the weight of caregiving and self-sacrifice. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure, I was no longer going to allow myself to be invisible. The days that followed felt like a tightrope walk, each step forward balancing on the fragile line between rage and resignation. I had thought that by speaking my truth, by standing up for myself, I might feel liberated, but the reality was far messier. Each day, the tension between us grew. We had fallen into an uneasy silence, a kind of truce where neither of us acknowledged the elephant in the room, the growing chasm between us. But I couldn't ignore it anymore. It gnawed at me, hollowed out my thoughts, and consumed my every action. I could see the way he watched me now, his eyes following my every move, as if unsure how to act around me. At first, I thought that perhaps his guilt would lead to a change, but I quickly realized that guilt wasn't enough. Apologies weren't enough. Words, no matter how carefully crafted, couldn't erase the years of neglect and resentment that had built up between us. In the mornings, I would rise early to get breakfast ready for him. I still did the same tasks, out of habit more than anything else. The kitchen became a battlefield of sorts. The soft clink of the coffee cup against the saucer, the rhythmic sound of the knife slicing through bread, these small actions felt like a quiet rebellion against the larger battle I was fighting within myself. I wasn't sure what I was doing anymore. Was I still playing the role of his caretaker? Or was I simply performing these tasks out of a sense of duty, as if I could somehow pretend that things were still normal? The answer was unclear, but the discomfort I felt with every task made it clear that this couldn't go on much longer. As the days wore on, I became more withdrawn. I no longer engaged in the casual conversations we once had, conversations about the future, about the things we would do when his recovery progressed. Instead, the house felt like a pressure cooker, the steam building up with every passing day. We had ceased being partners, and now, it felt as though we were strangers sharing a space. I had never felt more alone, despite the fact that he was physically present. The emotional distance between us was so great that I could barely remember the man I had married, the man who had once been my equal. But what was more disturbing than the emotional distance between us was the growing frustration within him. His anger had been simmering beneath the surface, just waiting for the right moment to burst. It started with small things. He would snap at me for the smallest mistake, for something I had done or hadn't done. The tone of his voice would change, sharp and accusatory, as if he were testing the limits of my patience. The frustration in his eyes was unmistakable, and I began to wonder if he resented me for standing up for myself. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, I entered the living room to find him sitting there, his hands clenched tightly on the arms of his wheelchair. His face was drawn with frustration, his jaw tight. The tension in the air was palpable. It was as though something had finally snapped inside him, and he was about to unleash it all. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the anticipation of what was to come thick in the room. "You've changed," he said suddenly, his voice low and harsh. His eyes locked onto mine, filled with a mixture of anger and confusion. "You're not the woman I married. You've become cold. Detached. I don't even recognize you anymore." I blinked, stunned by the words. I had expected anger, but not this. His words cut through me, deeper than anything he had said before. I had prepared myself for confrontation, but hearing him say those things, hearing him accuse me of being cold, stung in ways I hadn't anticipated. "I'm not cold," I said, my voice tight, though I could feel the lump in my throat threatening to choke me. "I'm just not going to be invisible anymore. I'm not going to be your maid. I'm not going to keep sacrificing myself." He narrowed his eyes, his expression darkening. "Sacrificing yourself? You think I don't appreciate everything you do for me? Do you think I want to be in this damn chair?" His voice cracked, and for a moment, I saw the pain behind the anger. But the hurt quickly morphed into something else. "You think this is easy for me? You think I don't know that I'm a burden on you?" His words were like a slap to the face. I could see the internal struggle within him, the guilt and frustration, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to excuse the way he had treated me, to excuse the years of neglect, the years of silence. "I never said you were a burden," I replied, my voice trembling with the weight of my own emotions. "But you have no idea what it's like to feel like you're losing yourself. I've put my life on hold for you. I've put my dreams on hold. And I don't even know who I am anymore." There was a pause as we both sat in the heavy silence that followed. I could feel the walls closing in, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. He was looking at me now, not with the anger of a man feeling sorry for himself, but with the look of a man who had no idea how to fix what was broken. He had always been the one in control, the one who led our lives. But now, he seemed lost, grasping for something to hold on to, while I was fighting for my own survival. "You've changed," he repeated, his voice softer now, though still tinged with frustration. "And I don't know how to fix it." I shook my head, feeling the weight of the words sinking in. "I don't know if I can fix this," I said quietly. "Maybe we're too far gone." The silence that followed was deafening. There was so much left unsaid between us, so many things we had avoided for far too long. But now, with the crack in our relationship wide open, there was no going back. I could see the fear in his eyes, fear that I was slipping away from him, fear that he was losing me for good. And it terrified him. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know if there was a way back from this, if there was a way to heal the wounds that had festered for so long. But one thing was certain, the tension between us had reached a boiling point. The years of unspoken anger, of silent resentment, had finally caught up with us. There was no denying it anymore. Our marriage, as we once knew it, was in danger of unraveling. The following weeks felt like a strange limbo, a time suspended between a past I could no longer recognize and a future I had no idea how to face. I felt like I was walking on a tightrope, one misstep away from falling into a chasm of unknowns. It was as if I had stepped outside of my own life and was watching myself from a distance, trying to make sense of everything, but unable to find a foothold. What had happened to us? What had happened to me? Every interaction with him felt like navigating a minefield. His eyes would follow me around the house, hesitant and uncertain. Sometimes, he would try to speak, to apologize, but the words never came out right. The guilt in his eyes was so raw, so painfully apparent, that it made my chest ache. But no amount of guilt could undo what had been said, what had been done. Apologies, no matter how sincere, felt like empty gestures, band-aids on wounds that ran much deeper. The pain wasn't just in the words he'd spoken, it was in the years of neglect, the unspoken resentment that had built up between us. And then there was the anger I had been hiding. Anger that, for so long, I had buried deep inside me, not wanting to confront it, not wanting to acknowledge that I was capable of feeling it. But now, it burned in me every time I looked at him. His presence, which once felt like comfort, now felt like an anchor dragging me down. The man I had once loved was still there, somewhere beneath the surface, but I didn't know if I could ever find him again. I had always thought of myself as someone who was strong, someone who could endure anything. But now, I was beginning to realize that my strength wasn't about enduring. It wasn't about sacrificing everything for someone else's happiness while letting my own slowly slip away. My strength, I now understood, was about choosing myself. Choosing to not let myself be diminished, to not let myself disappear into the shadows of someone else's life. I was a woman, not just a caretaker. I was a person, not just a wife. One evening, after another long day of silence between us, I decided to take a walk. The air was cool against my skin, and the sky was painted in soft shades of orange and pink. I had always loved walking in the evening, the solitude giving me a space to think. As I stepped outside, the familiar scent of the earth and the breeze wrapped around me, and for a moment, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in ages. It was as if the world outside our home had not yet been tainted by the pain that had settled within our walls. I needed this time away from him, away from the heaviness of the house. I needed to feel like myself again. The woman who had once been free. The woman who had dreams and aspirations. The woman who had a life before I became a caretaker. But even as I walked, my mind kept returning to him. The man who had once been my equal, my partner. The man who had now become a stranger, someone I wasn't sure I knew anymore. The walk took me longer than I had planned. I didn't want to go back. But eventually, the sun began to set, and I knew it was time. As I walked back toward the house, I could feel the familiar sense of dread creeping over me. What would happen when I stepped back into that house? Would he be waiting for me, his eyes filled with apologies that I wasn't sure I could accept? Would I be able to look at him and see him as the man I once loved, or had that part of him already died? I entered the house to find him sitting in the living room, the same tense expression on his face. When he saw me, his posture seemed to relax slightly, but there was still an air of uncertainty between us. "I didn't know where you went," he said quietly, his voice almost tentative. "I needed some space," I replied, my voice calm but distant. I didn't know how to explain it to him, how I was feeling, what I needed. It wasn't something that could be easily explained, not something he could just fix with a few words or gestures. This was something deeper. It was a shift that had happened within me, something that I couldn't undo. He nodded, as if he understood, but I knew he didn't. How could he? How could he possibly understand the depth of what I was going through? He had no idea how much of myself I had lost in the process of caring for him, how much of my identity had been buried under the weight of his needs. "I'm sorry for what I said," he said after a long pause. "I didn't mean it. I was just frustrated. I didn't know what to say. I never wanted to hurt you." I could see the sincerity in his eyes, and for a brief moment, I almost allowed myself to soften. But then I remembered everything, the years of sacrifice, the years of silence. His apology, though sincere, couldn't erase the way I had felt all those years. I had been living in the shadow of his needs for so long that I had forgotten what it was like to exist for myself. "You can't just apologize, and everything will be okay," I said, my voice low but steady. "I've been living for you for so long. I've been your caretaker, your maid, your everything. But I'm not okay. And I don't think I can keep doing this." His face fell, the hurt evident in his eyes, but I couldn't back down. I had to say it, even if it hurt both of us. "I need to find myself again," I continued. "I need to remember who I am, apart from this role I've been playing. I'm not just your wife. I'm not just your caretaker. I'm me. And I need to start living for me again." The words hung in the air, thick and heavy, between us. I could see the realization hitting him, the weight of what I was saying sinking in. But it wasn't just a realization for him. It was a realization for me, too. I couldn't go back to the way things had been. I couldn't keep sacrificing myself for a love that had turned into something unrecognizable. I had to let go. "I understand," he said quietly, though the sadness in his voice was palpable. "I don't want to lose you." "You already have," I replied softly, my heart aching. "I don't know who I am anymore. But I need to find out." There was a long silence, and in that silence, I could feel something shift between us. It wasn't a moment of reconciliation, but a moment of understanding. We weren't the same people we had been when we first met, when we first fell in love. And that was okay. But it also meant that we had to figure out who we were now, and if that meant walking separate paths, then so be it. As I walked away from him, I knew that this was the turning point. The point of no return. There was no going back to the way things had been. But there was hope, too. Hope that I could find myself again, hope that he could find his peace as well. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was standing on my own 2 feet again. And that, in itself, was the first step toward healing. The days that followed my conversation with him felt like a quiet storm. While there was no shouting, no outburst, the emotional tension between us was palpable, as if an invisible wall had been erected in our home. We still shared the same space, but we were no longer the same people. The distance between us had grown wider, and no amount of apologies, no matter how sincere, could bridge the gap. What had once been a marriage of shared dreams and hopes now felt like 2 people simply existing in the same place, no longer connected by the love that had once bound them. In the mornings, I would go about my routine, making breakfast, tending to the house, but the actions felt hollow. I moved through the motions, but my heart wasn't in it. It was as if I was pretending to be someone I no longer recognized. I still took care of him, still cooked, still cleaned. But every task, every simple action felt like a betrayal of the woman I was trying to become. I was no longer content to be his caretaker, his free maid. And yet, I couldn't shake the years of habit. The routine was ingrained in me, like a second skin I couldn't peel away, no matter how hard I tried. He didn't make it any easier. While he had promised to respect my need for space, I could feel his gaze on me whenever he thought I wasn't looking. It wasn't just curiosity. It was something deeper, something more desperate. He was searching for something, an apology, a sign that I was still the woman he had married, or perhaps just an acknowledgement that everything would somehow return to normal. But I couldn't give that to him. I had tried to be the woman he wanted, the wife who put everything aside for him, but that woman no longer existed. And even if she did, I wasn't sure I wanted her back. One afternoon, as I sat at the kitchen table, reading a book I had picked up months ago but never had the time to read, I heard him approach. He didn't knock or announce his presence, just rolled into the room, his wheelchair making the familiar, heavy noise against the floor. I looked up, meeting his gaze, but didn't speak right away. I had nothing left to say. "I know you're angry with me," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that felt too heavy for the room. "But you're shutting me out. And I don't know how to fix this." I closed the book in my hands, the gesture symbolic of the emotional distance that had grown between us. "You can't fix it," I replied, my voice steady but edged with frustration. "You can't just apologize and expect everything to be fine. You can't take back the years of what we've become. I've given so much of myself, and you've never truly seen it. I've been your caretaker, your provider, and in the process, I've lost who I am. And now, I'm trying to find myself again. That's not something you can fix with a simple apology." He flinched at my words, as if they struck him physically. But I wasn't sure if it was because he truly understood what I was saying or because he was simply ashamed of how much I had suffered in silence. Either way, his guilt wasn't going to make everything okay again. "I never asked you to lose yourself," he said, his voice low, almost pleading. "I never wanted you to feel like you weren't enough. Then why did you make me feel like I was nothing more than a maid?" I shot back, the anger rising in my chest once again. "I've given up everything for you. And you've never even appreciated it." The words were out before I could stop them, but once they were spoken, I knew they were the truth. For years, I had sacrificed my own desires, my own sense of self, for him. And in return, I had received nothing but resentment. It wasn't just the words he had spoken, though they were brutal, it was the years of emotional neglect, the lack of recognition for everything I had done. I had become a shadow in my own life, a ghost of the woman I once was, fading into the background of his needs. "I didn't mean it like that," he said, though there was no conviction in his voice. He was starting to sound desperate, his words stammering and unsteady. "I was just frustrated. I didn't mean to hurt you." "I know you didn't mean it," I replied, my voice softening slightly, though the frustration still lingered. "But intentions don't matter when the damage has been done. It's not just about what you said, it's about everything that led up to that moment. I've been giving, and I've lost myself in the process. And now, I need to take something back." There was a long pause as he sat silently, the weight of my words settling between us like a cloud that neither of us could push away. It wasn't that I didn't care for him, I still loved him, or at least, the man he had once been. But love was no longer enough to fix everything that had been broken. I had spent so many years trying to be the perfect wife, the perfect caretaker, the perfect partner. But I was no longer willing to sacrifice myself for the sake of a relationship that had become so one-sided. "I don't know what to do anymore," he finally admitted, his voice cracking slightly. "I don't know how to fix us." I stood up from the table, not in anger, but in quiet resolve. "Maybe we're too far gone to fix," I said, my voice steady, though the words felt heavy on my tongue. "Maybe we've reached a point where we need to figure out what we want, separately." His eyes widened at my words, as if the idea of separation had never crossed his mind. But in truth, I had been thinking about it more and more lately. It wasn't that I didn't care about him, it was that I had been suffocating under the weight of his needs for so long that I didn't know who I was anymore. I had to learn how to live for myself again. And I couldn't do that if I was constantly being reminded of the woman I used to be, the woman who had been happy in her marriage, who had given everything to keep him comfortable. "You're not leaving me, are you?" he asked, his voice so small, so fragile, that it felt like a dagger to my heart. I didn't answer him immediately. Part of me wanted to say yes, to tell him that I couldn't do this anymore, that I couldn't keep sacrificing myself. But another part of me wanted to hold on to the man I had once loved, to find a way back to the relationship we had before everything had gone wrong. "I don't know," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I do know this, I can't keep living like this. I need to figure out who I am, outside of all of this." The room fell silent again. He didn't speak, and I didn't know what else to say. The decision wasn't about him. It was about me. I needed to find myself again, to reclaim the woman I had buried beneath years of caregiving and sacrifice. And no matter how much it hurt, no matter how much I wanted to stay, I couldn't keep losing myself in the process. As I walked away, I didn't know what the future would hold for us. But I knew one thing: I was no longer going to allow myself to be invisible. The silence that had settled over the house after that conversation was suffocating, a constant reminder of how far we had drifted apart. It wasn't just the words we had exchanged, or even the emotional wounds we had inflicted on each other. It was the realization that, for the first time in years, we were no longer on the same page. We had crossed a line, and now, there was no going back. I thought that by confronting the truth, by standing up for myself, I would feel some sense of relief. But instead, I felt more lost than ever. The walls of the house seemed to close in on me with every passing day. Every room, every corner, felt like a reminder of everything we had been, everything we had lost. The house, once filled with the laughter and warmth of a shared life, now felt like a mausoleum of what could have been. In the days following our conversation, things became unbearable. We spoke less and less. When we did, it was with an edge of discomfort, a distance that seemed to grow with every word. He had apologized, but his apology, though heartfelt, was insufficient. Words alone couldn't fix what had been broken. The emotional damage ran deeper than I could have imagined, and though I wanted to believe that time would heal us, I knew it wasn't that simple. I had thought that stepping away from him, emotionally, would give me the clarity I needed. But instead, it only made things worse. The guilt that gnawed at me for wanting to distance myself from him was unbearable. How could I be so selfish? How could I be so callous when he needed me more than ever? But that was the problem, wasn't it? I had always been there for him, always put his needs above mine. I had been so focused on being his caretaker that I had forgotten about my own needs, my own sense of self. And now, I didn't know how to get back to myself. I didn't know how to reclaim the woman I had been before this all started. I was lost in the space between who I was and who I was becoming, unsure of which direction to turn. One night, I found myself staring at the empty bed beside me, the sheets cold and untouched. He had retired to his wheelchair, as usual, and the space between us seemed impossibly wide. I had spent so many nights lying awake next to him, listening to the sound of his breath and wishing I could somehow fix things. But now, there was no comfort in that silence. It felt like a void, a cavern that echoed with the distance between us. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think. The weight of everything pressed down on me, suffocating me, until I couldn't breathe. I had wanted to be strong, to be the woman who had the power to change things, but now, I was drowning. I felt like I was slowly losing myself, unable to find my way back to the person I once was. The next morning, I found him in the kitchen, his face drawn and pale. He didn't meet my eyes, and for a moment, I wondered if he could feel it too, that the distance had grown too wide, too deep, to ever bridge again. "I don't know what to do anymore," he said quietly, his voice breaking the silence between us. "I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to make you see that I'm sorry." I wanted to tell him that it wasn't enough. That his apology, no matter how sincere, couldn't undo the years of emotional neglect, the years of feeling invisible. But instead, I just stood there, staring at him, feeling a sense of emptiness spread through me. The man I had once loved seemed like a stranger now, someone I couldn't quite reach. "You don't understand," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "You can't fix this with words. You can't apologize and expect everything to be okay. It's not just about what you said, it's about everything that led up to that moment. I've been losing myself for so long, and now, I don't know who I am anymore." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and frustration. "I didn't want to hurt you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted to make you feel like you weren't enough. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to fix it. I wanted to scream, to tell him that he couldn't fix this, that this wasn't something that could be undone. But I didn't. Instead, I just nodded, feeling the weight of the moment press down on me. I had never felt more trapped, more lost, than I did right then. We spent the rest of the day in silence, the air between us thick with unspoken words and emotions we couldn't process. I had never felt more distant from him. I had never felt more alone. That evening, after dinner, he tried again. "I know things have been hard," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "But I don't want to lose you. Please, just don't give up on us." His words, though desperate, didn't reach me. I wanted to reach out to him, to tell him that I didn't want to give up either. But the truth was, I didn't know what I wanted anymore. I didn't know if I could keep living in this emotional vacuum, where we were both clinging to something that no longer existed. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," I said quietly, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. "I don't know if I can keep sacrificing myself for a relationship that's become one-sided." He looked at me, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You're talking about leaving me," he said, his voice barely audible, as if the words were too much to bear. "After everything we've been through, you're talking about leaving?" I could hear the pain in his voice, but I couldn't let it sway me. I had to be honest with myself. I couldn't keep living for someone else's happiness at the expense of my own. I couldn't keep losing myself in a relationship that no longer felt like a partnership. "I'm not sure what's left for us anymore," I said softly, the weight of my words sinking in. "I don't know if there's anything left to fix." The look in his eyes shattered me. I had never seen him so vulnerable, so broken. And yet, even in that moment, I knew that there was no easy fix. There was no magic word, no simple gesture that could undo the damage. We were too far gone. We had lost each other somewhere along the way, and no matter how much we loved each other, we couldn't find our way back. As I left the room, I felt like I was leaving a part of myself behind. I didn't know what the future held for us, but I knew one thing: the person I had been was gone, and I didn't know how to get her back. The crisis had begun, and the fallout had only just begun to take shape. Healing was not a straight path. It wasn't a quick fix or a magical transformation. It was slow, messy, and filled with doubts. But it was necessary. For the first time in years, I was choosing to focus on myself, to reclaim the parts of me I had lost in the shadows of caregiving. And as I took those first tentative steps away from the emotional wreckage of my marriage, I was terrified. I had always been the type of person who put others first. My marriage, my role as a caretaker, it had all been about giving, giving, giving. And somewhere along the way, I had forgotten that I, too, had needs. I had dreams. I had desires that had been buried beneath years of silent sacrifice. The mornings were the hardest. I would wake up and, for a fleeting moment, everything would feel normal. I would hear the soft rustle of sheets as he shifted in bed, or the faint sound of him trying to get up, and for a brief second, the illusion would return: the life we had, the life I had thought we would always have. But it was fleeting. The reality of the situation would quickly flood back, reminding me that things were no longer the way they once were. The first few days after our emotional confrontation, I felt the ache of loneliness in my chest. I had never realized how deeply intertwined our lives had been. Everything we did, from the smallest daily routines to the grandest plans, had been intertwined. And now, those routines felt hollow. I found myself walking around the house, unsure of what to do with myself. There were no tasks to focus on, no endless list of things I had to do. For the first time in years, I had no role to play, no script to follow. So, I began to rebuild my life, bit by bit, in whatever small way I could. I started by reconnecting with old friends. There was Emma, a childhood friend I hadn't seen in ages, and Lisa, a woman I had once shared a creative project with. I called them up, tentative at first, unsure if they would even remember me. But they did. And their voices, warm and familiar, were like a lifeline thrown to me in the dark. Over the next few weeks, I found myself spending more time outside the house. I went on walks in the park, rediscovered old hobbies I had once enjoyed, and even took a few yoga classes. I had forgotten how much I loved the feeling of moving my body, of stretching and breathing. It wasn't just physical exercise, it was a way for me to reconnect with myself, to remind myself that I was more than just a caretaker. There was something liberating about spending time on my own terms. I didn't have to explain myself. I didn't have to justify my actions. I could simply be. And for the first time in a long while, I could hear my own thoughts without the constant hum of anxiety, guilt, and exhaustion that had once filled every waking moment. But even as I began to feel small glimmers of joy, I knew that the journey was far from over. The guilt still lingered. Every time I spoke with my husband, I could hear the desperation in his voice, the longing for things to return to the way they had been. He didn't understand. He couldn't understand. And the more he tried to pull me back into the roles I had once played, the more I felt myself retreating. One afternoon, about a month after our last conversation, he asked me if we could talk. I agreed, though I wasn't sure what to expect. I had stopped trying to fix things, stopped hoping that we could go back to the way we were. But there was still a part of me that cared for him, that wanted to believe that our love was enough to heal the wounds between us. We sat across from each other in the living room. He seemed different somehow, more withdrawn, more distant. It was as if he, too, had begun to realize that things had changed irreparably. But the sadness in his eyes told me that he wasn't ready to let go of what we had been. "I've been thinking," he began slowly, his voice quieter than usual. "And I know I've made a lot of mistakes. But I want you to know that I'm not giving up on us." I didn't know how to respond. There was a part of me that wanted to tell him that I wasn't sure I could keep going down this path. That I wasn't sure we were capable of going back to what we once had. But there was also a part of me that wanted to believe him, that wanted to believe that we could find our way back to some kind of happiness together. "You don't have to give up," I said, my voice soft but firm. "But I need to take care of myself first. I need to heal. I need to find out who I am, outside of all of this." He nodded, though his face remained somber. "I understand. I just don't want to lose you." "I don't want to lose you either," I replied, the words heavy in my chest. "But I need to find myself again before I can truly be there for you." It was the first time I had spoken those words out loud, and though they felt like a release, they also carried a weight. I was no longer the woman who would silently sacrifice everything for the sake of someone else's happiness. I was learning to put myself first, to recognize that my own well-being mattered. The conversation ended with a fragile understanding between us. He was still in pain, still holding on to the hope that we could make things work, but I knew that I couldn't give him false hope. I wasn't ready to give up on our marriage completely, but I wasn't ready to go back to the way things were either. I had to keep moving forward, even if it meant walking alone for a while. As the days passed, I felt myself growing stronger. I began to forgive myself for the years I had spent living for someone else, for the woman I had become. I began to embrace the idea that I was allowed to be happy, to live for myself. And as I did, I began to feel more at peace with the decisions I had made. I didn't know what the future held for us. I didn't know if our marriage could survive this. But I knew one thing for sure, I was no longer going to lose myself in the process. And that was the first step toward healing. The night felt different. The air, heavier. Every step I took seemed deliberate, as if I were walking toward a precipice, unsure of what awaited me on the other side. I could feel the tension between my husband and me building to a point where it could no longer be ignored, no longer be postponed. For the past several weeks, we had been walking around each other like strangers, pretending that things weren't falling apart. But the truth was undeniable. We were teetering on the edge of something neither of us could control. I had spent so many years trying to hold on to what we had, trying to save a marriage that felt like it was slipping through my fingers. But now, the weight of that effort had worn me down. It was like I was drowning, and no matter how hard I tried to reach for the surface, the water kept pulling me under. I could no longer ignore the truth, we had changed, both of us. And what we had once had was no longer enough to keep us together. I had tried to give him the space he needed to understand what I was going through, tried to show him that I needed to find myself again. But despite all my efforts, despite all my attempts to rebuild my own identity, I could see the toll it had taken on him. The guilt, the desperation in his eyes, it was impossible to ignore. And for a while, I had thought that maybe, just maybe, things could go back to the way they were. But deep down, I knew that was a fantasy. The damage had been done. We were two people who no longer knew how to be together. I had finally reached the point where I could no longer pretend. I had done the emotional work, had spent weeks finding the woman I had lost all those years ago. And now, it was time to face the truth. I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't keep sacrificing myself for a relationship that no longer nourished either of us. It wasn't about love. It was about survival. It was about learning to live for myself. And so, when he called me into the living room that evening, I knew what had to be done. There was no more avoiding it. No more pretending. We had to face the reality of our situation. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice strained, his hands gripping the arms of his wheelchair. "I can't keep doing this, Maya. I can't keep pretending that everything is okay. I can't keep pretending that I'm not hurting, that I don't need you. But I also know I can't keep asking you to be something you're not. I've been selfish. And I don't know what to do anymore." His words felt like a punch to my gut. Not because they were untrue, but because they echoed everything I had been feeling for so long. He was still clinging to the hope that things could somehow go back to normal, that we could fix what was broken. But I knew now that it wasn't possible. We couldn't go back. We could only move forward, whatever that meant. "I know you're hurting," I said softly, my voice steady despite the wave of emotion that threatened to overtake me. "But I can't keep living for you. I can't keep losing myself in the process. I've given so much of myself to this marriage, to you, and now I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know if I can keep being the person you need me to be." I paused, taking a breath, feeling the weight of my words settle between us. This wasn't just a conversation anymore. It was a reckoning. The point where the truth could no longer be ignored. "I've spent so many years being your caretaker, being your wife, trying to be everything you needed," I continued, my voice trembling ever so slightly. "But in the process, I've lost myself. I've lost who I am. And I can't keep doing that. I can't keep losing myself for the sake of a relationship that's not healthy for either of us. I need to be me again." There was a long silence as he processed my words. I could see the struggle on his face, the mixture of pain, guilt, and disbelief. It was like he was hearing these things for the first time, even though I had said them to him before. He had never fully understood the depth of my emotional exhaustion, the extent to which I had submerged myself in the role of caretaker. And now, as he heard the finality in my voice, he was beginning to realize just how far we had drifted apart. "I never meant to make you feel like you were nothing more than my caretaker," he said, his voice breaking. "I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't realize what I was doing to you until it was too late." I could see the sincerity in his eyes, but it wasn't enough. His apology, as heartfelt as it was, couldn't undo the years of emotional neglect, the resentment that had built up inside me. I couldn't keep going back and forth, vacillating between anger and love. It wasn't healthy for either of us. "I know you didn't mean to hurt me," I said quietly, my heart heavy. "But the damage is done. I've been drowning in this marriage for so long, trying to be everything for you, and I've lost who I am in the process. I can't keep doing this." He looked at me, his eyes filled with unshed tears, and for a moment, I saw the man I had once loved. The man who had been my partner, my equal. But that man was gone now, and I wasn't sure if he could ever return. "I don't want to lose you," he whispered, his voice so small, so broken. "But I know I can't keep asking you to stay if it's killing you inside. I don't want you to resent me. I don't want you to lose yourself for me." His words hit me harder than anything else. It wasn't the desperation in his voice or the tears in his eyes, it was the realization that he understood. For the first time, he understood what I had been going through. And though it hurt to admit, I knew that this was the only way forward. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay. I couldn't keep holding on to a relationship that had become a shadow of what it once was. "I'm not sure what happens next," I said softly, my voice full of uncertainty. "But I know one thing, I can't keep living like this. I have to find myself again. And I need to do that on my own." The finality of the words hung in the air, the weight of them pressing down on both of us. There was no easy way to say goodbye to a life we had built together, to a love that had once been so strong. But I knew I couldn't stay. I couldn't keep sacrificing myself for a relationship that no longer served either of us. "I understand," he said quietly, his voice barely a whisper. "I'll always love you, Maya. Always." And in that moment, I realized something. As much as I had tried to fight it, as much as I had hoped for a miracle, we had both reached a point where we had to let go. It was painful. It was heartbreaking. But it was also necessary. I couldn't keep living in the past. I couldn't keep holding on to something that was no longer there. As I walked away from him that night, I knew that it was over. Not just the marriage, but the person I had once been. The woman who had sacrificed everything for the sake of another. I was finally learning to live for myself. The days after our final conversation felt like a blur, a whirlwind of emotions that I could neither escape nor fully embrace. It was as if I had been living in a fog for so long that now, with the weight of the truth finally out in the open, the world around me felt both clearer and more terrifying. The air, once thick with unspoken words and hidden frustrations, had finally cleared, leaving behind a raw, exposed version of myself that I wasn't entirely sure I was ready to face. I spent the first few days alone, processing everything that had happened, the confrontation, the decisions, the realization that my marriage was over. I didn't know what came next. I didn't know what kind of future lay ahead, but for the first time in years, I was free. Free from the emotional weight that had been suffocating me. Free from the constant battle of trying to hold on to a relationship that was no longer working. But freedom didn't come without its own set of challenges. I had spent so much of my life taking care of others, sacrificing my own happiness for the sake of someone else, that I had no idea how to care for myself. It was like learning to walk again, taking baby steps toward a future that was both thrilling and frightening. I had to rebuild my life from the ground up, and that wasn't going to be easy. The first few weeks after the separation were filled with a mixture of emotions, relief, guilt, sadness, and hope. There were moments when I wondered if I had made the right decision. There were moments when I missed him, when I longed for the life we had once shared. But there were also moments when I felt a sense of peace, a sense of self that I hadn't experienced in years. It was as if I were finally coming back to life, finally waking up from a long, exhausting slumber. I began to take better care of myself. I went to therapy, something I had always put off because I felt like I didn't have the time or the energy for it. But now, I was making time. I was learning to understand myself, to process my emotions in a healthy way. I was no longer running from my feelings, no longer ignoring the pain that had built up over the years. And as I worked through the layers of hurt, guilt, and anger, I found that healing was possible. I reached out to my friends, the ones I had distanced myself from over the years. I had let my marriage consume me, had let my role as a caretaker isolate me from the people who had once been my support system. But now, I was reconnecting. I started to make plans with friends, to enjoy simple things like dinners out and long walks in the park. I was rediscovering the parts of myself that had been buried for so long. But even with all the progress I was making, there was still a part of me that held on to the past. There were moments when I would catch myself thinking about him, about our life together. I would remember the way his eyes used to light up when he smiled, the way he would hold me when the world felt too heavy. Those memories were bittersweet now, and they brought a wave of grief that I wasn't quite prepared for. One evening, I went through old photographs. I found pictures of our wedding day, of the vacations we had taken, of the moments that had once felt so full of promise and hope. Looking at them, I felt a pang of loss, a deep ache for the life we had once shared. But I also realized something: those memories, as beautiful as they were, didn't define me anymore. They were part of my past, yes, but they were no longer the story I was living. The truth was, I had grown. I had learned so much from the pain, from the mistakes, from the years of sacrificing myself for the sake of someone else. I had learned to find my voice again, to stand up for what I needed, to take ownership of my own happiness. And that was something no one could take away from me. I had come to understand that my worth was not defined by my role as a wife or a caretaker. It was defined by who I was as a person, by the love and care I gave to myself, by the strength I found in adversity. I had finally begun to recognize my own value, something I had neglected for far too long. One afternoon, after a particularly emotional therapy session, I sat down at the kitchen table and wrote a letter to him. It wasn't to ask for reconciliation. It wasn't to reopen old wounds. It was a letter of closure, a way for me to release everything I had been holding inside. I needed to say the things I had never been able to say, to express the hurt and the love and the gratitude, all in one breath. I wrote about the years we had spent together, about the love we had once shared. I wrote about the pain I had felt, about the moments when I had felt invisible, when I had lost myself in the role of caretaker. But I also wrote about the strength I had found in the aftermath, about the person I was becoming, the woman who was learning to live for herself. In the end, I wrote, I will always cherish the love we had, but I need to walk my own path now. I need to find peace, and I need to find myself. I hope you can find that peace too, in your own way. And though we may never be the same, I will always wish you the best. It wasn't a goodbye. It wasn't an ultimatum. It was simply the truth. I needed to let go, to release him and the relationship we had built, so that I could move forward. It was a painful but necessary step toward healing. When I sent the letter, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It was the final act of closure, the last piece of emotional baggage I needed to release in order to fully move forward. And with that, I began to feel a sense of peace settle within me. I wasn't sure what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure: I was no longer defined by my past. I was no longer defined by my marriage. I was defined by the person I was becoming, and that was enough. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, I began to embrace this new chapter of my life. There was still pain, of course, pain from the loss of a love I had once thought would last forever, pain from the years I had spent losing myself. But there was also hope. There was joy in the little things, in rediscovering myself, in learning to live again. I was no longer waiting for someone to save me. I was saving myself. Time has a way of healing wounds, but it doesn't erase them. The scars remain, reminders of the journey I've been through, the pain, the heartbreak, the self-discovery. And as I sit here now, looking out at the sunset, I can't help but reflect on everything that has brought me to this moment. It's been a year since I made the decision to walk away, to let go of a marriage that had become more of a burden than a source of joy. A year since I found the courage to choose myself, to reclaim my identity, to live for me. And while the journey has been anything but easy, I can say with full certainty that it has been worth it. Because I have learned more about myself in the past year than I ever thought possible. And I have learned that it is okay to put yourself first. It is okay to walk away from something that no longer serves you, even if it is painful. I spent months alone, rebuilding my life. There were moments of doubt, moments when I questioned whether I had made the right decision. There were moments when I missed him, when I wished things could be different. But as the days passed, I found myself growing stronger, more confident, more whole. I began to see the beauty in life again, to experience joy in the little things. I rediscovered hobbies I had long forgotten, reconnected with old friends, and found new passions. And slowly, but surely, I began to heal. I never thought I would be able to love again. Not in the way I had once loved him. Not in the way that consumes you, that makes you believe that one person is your entire world. But what I've come to understand is that love isn't always about the big gestures, the grand declarations. Sometimes, love is about the quiet moments. It's about the way you look at someone when you know they've seen you at your best and worst, and they still choose to be there. A few months ago, I met someone. His name is Ethan, and he is nothing like the man I married. He is kind, patient, and he sees me for who I am, not who I used to be. With Ethan, I don't have to pretend to be someone I'm not. I don't have to hide parts of myself to make him happy. He accepts me, flaws and all, and he encourages me to continue growing, to continue being the woman I've become. It's been a slow, steady relationship, built on mutual respect and understanding. And for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. But even as I've moved on, I haven't forgotten the lessons I learned from my marriage. I haven't forgotten the pain, the struggle, or the years I spent sacrificing myself for someone else. I carry those lessons with me every day, and they have shaped the person I am today. One of the hardest things about leaving was the guilt. The guilt of walking away from someone I had loved for so long, someone I had shared my life with. The guilt of knowing that he was struggling, that he was facing his own demons, while I was out here living my life. I hated myself for it, at times. I hated the idea of him being alone, of him having to face the world without me by his side. But I had to learn that I couldn't save him. I couldn't fix him. And I couldn't sacrifice my own happiness for his. There were nights when I would lie awake, wondering how he was doing, wondering if he was okay. I would replay the moments we shared, the laughter, the love, the tenderness. And I would think, what if I made the wrong choice? What if I should have stayed? What if I could have done more? But then I would remember the years of emotional exhaustion, the years of feeling invisible, the years of neglect. I would remember how I had lost myself, how I had given everything and received so little in return. And I would realize that staying would have meant sacrificing myself all over again. One day, I decided to visit him. It wasn't out of guilt or obligation. It was because I had come to a place where I no longer felt the weight of our past. I had forgiven myself, and I wanted to make sure he had forgiven me too, not because I needed his forgiveness, but because I needed closure. When I walked into his room, it felt like stepping into another lifetime. He was sitting in his wheelchair, staring out the window, lost in thought. The sight of him, the man I once loved, hit me harder than I expected. But there was no anger in me anymore, no resentment. There was only a quiet sadness, a sadness for what we had lost, for what could never be again. He looked up when he heard the door open, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. We just looked at each other, two people who had once been everything to each other, now strangers trying to make sense of the ruins of our relationship. "I didn't expect to see you," he said quietly, his voice carrying a mix of surprise and something deeper, regret, perhaps. "I didn't expect to be here either," I replied, my voice steady. "But I needed to see you. I needed to make sure you were okay." He looked at me, his eyes filled with 1,000 unspoken words. "I'm trying," he said, his voice breaking. "It's been hard, Maya. I've been through a lot, and I know I hurt you. I'm sorry for everything I did." "I know," I said, my voice soft. "And I'm sorry too. For all the times I lost myself. For all the times I didn't speak up." We sat in silence for a while, both of us processing the years we had spent together, the years that had slipped away without us realizing it. It wasn't a happy reunion. It wasn't a moment of dramatic reconciliation. But it was a moment of understanding. A moment of peace. "I hope you find happiness, Maya," he said quietly. "I really do." "And I hope you find peace," I replied, my voice thick with emotion. "You deserve that." And in that moment, I realized something. I had forgiven him. I had forgiven myself. We both had. The emotional baggage that had once weighed us down had finally been lifted. We were no longer tethered to the past. We had both moved on, in our own ways, with our own lives. As I walked out of that room, I felt lighter. Not because I had found all the answers, but because I had come to terms with the fact that sometimes things don't work out the way you expect. Sometimes, you have to let go of what you thought you wanted in order to embrace the life that is waiting for you. I knew now that I was no longer defined by my past. I was no longer defined by my marriage or my role as a caretaker. I was defined by who I had become, the woman who had chosen to reclaim her own life, to find herself again, to learn to love herself. And that was enough. As I looked out at the horizon, the sun dipping below the trees, I felt a quiet sense of peace. The journey had been long, but it had led me here. To this moment. To this life. And for the first time in years, I was exactly where I was supposed to be.